Good afternoon, everyone. My name is David Madison. I'm the Executive Director of the Southwestern Association of Episcopal Schools. Welcome to our webinar series. Today we're going to look at best practices for board treasurers. And I'm joined by our presenter today, who also serves as the Director of Professional Development for SAES, Mary Catherine Duffy. Mary Catherine, good afternoon.
Hello, everyone. Glad you're all here and looking forward to some good information today.
Thanks, Mary Catherine. We're looking forward to looking at the role of the board treasurer, how critical that is to the success of a school. And so hopefully our goal today will be accomplished by looking at some very practical hands-on tips to make that role function as strong as it possibly can. So a few pieces of housekeeping before we get started. First, just a reminder to everyone, we will record this session and we will also send you a link to the recording so you can take a look at this again, or if you have some other members of your board or members of the community who would like to take a look, they certainly are welcome to do so. We'll also send you a PDF of the slides, so don't feel like you have to take notes of everything that's contained on the slides. We'll make sure you get a copy of those as well. And then finally, I want to make sure everyone knows how to use the Q&A box. So you will see a button at the bottom of your screen that says Q&A. If you'll click on that button right now, let's take the Q&A box for a test drive. If you'll type in the city where you are joining us from, then that will show me that the Q&A box is working. So let's give that a try right now. If you'll click on Q&A and in your city, and I'm seeing cities rolling through right now, so that's working very well. So throughout the presentation today, please use that Q&A box. If questions pop up, if there are points of clarification that you'd like to make, go ahead and collect those, put those in the Q&A box, and then at times throughout the presentation today, we'll stop and get those questions answered, and then we have time at the end of the webinar today for your questions as well. So again, welcome. It's a pleasure to see everyone today. I'm going to turn it over to our presenter, Mary Catherine Duffy. Mary Catherine, take it away.
Well, hi, everyone. First of all, I want to welcome you here to Board Treasurer Best Practices. This is a really important topic for us to explore today, and I want to just tell you that over the 17 years that I was at St. Albans, I had the great luck of having a lot of great board treasurers and a great business manager, and so. Today's webinar is really kind of a lot of my experience of what worked well and what did not. So let's start just talking about the topics that we're going to cover today. The first topic is going to be the role of the board treasurer, kind of just talking about what your job is as a board treasurer. We're going to talk about the best operating practices for good financial management, and then we're going to discuss some keys for having successful relationships between the board treasurer and the head of school. That's a really important relationship, and we're going to talk about that. So if you have just been elected to the school board treasurer position, I know that you're doing your happy dance. You're very excited about that. So what does that mean for you? What is that job entail? And so we're just going to start by talking about some of the roles that the board treasurer will take. The first one is just the assisting the head of school and the business manager with creation of and presentation of the annual budget. We're going to talk a little bit later about the annual budget and how that looks, but definitely having a role in the creation of that budget is part of the role of the board treasurer. One other topic is the preparation and the presentation of the treasurer reports at monthly board meetings. Depending upon what each board requires, the board treasurer will offer up balance sheet, operating statement, that sort of thing at every board meeting. This is something that a lot of times we see that people are not sure, we're not sure that people are doing, and it's a really important thing for the board to have that board treasurer present monthly reports at those meetings. Of course, depending on the school policies, signing and approving checks and other payments, that's part of the board treasurer's role. And and the head of school typically will be the signer on checks, but when there are things at a bank or anything like that, our board treasurer was also a signer on that in case there's a situation where the head of school is out or is unable to sign a check. It's important for that to take place. Signing the annual tax return for the organization, chairing the finance committee for the board. This is something that we think is really important as from SAES. The finance committee serves an important role on the board, and the role of the board treasurer is to chair that committee and to ensure that committee is meeting on the regular and doing the work that they need to do. Representing the board and ensuring that best practices of financial management are taking place. The board treasurer is the liaison sort of between the operations administration and the board, making sure that the things that the business office is supposed to be doing, that's taking place. And the board treasurer also serves as a resource for the head of school, for the business manager when it comes to financial management. And so that's a great role. And then finally, reviewing the monthly financials of the school and making sure that there are no accounting errors, there are no financial errors. That's always really helpful. As a head of school, I depended on my board treasurers to be a third set of eyes in case there was something that we missed or that they didn't understand. They could ask those questions. And I would offer that as the board treasurer, it is your responsibility to ask questions and to look thoroughly for mistakes, because people make mistakes, and it's really important that sometimes when we're in the role of head of school or business manager, we're busy and we're doing things we're doing other things besides financial stuff, and it's nice to know that we've got somebody that's also looking to be sure that if there's a mistake that we catch it. So we have a poll question. Does your school have a board finance committee that meets monthly? We want you to answer that question in the Q&A box. Does your school have a finance committee that meets monthly?
And we'll just wait for a few more seconds. Okay, I think we've got everyone's answers in. So here is how the results look.
Okay, good. So yes, that's good news that we have 80% of our people that are saying yes, they do have a monthly finance committee meeting. That's really critical for the board to be able to ensure that you guys are doing the work. At those finance committees, I do want to say that you should be taking minutes at those meetings, that you should be not only taking minutes, but that you should keep those minutes as a matter of record. And that's one of the things in the documents and adherence to standards that you're going to need to have is minutes for that.
And then for schools where the finance committee isn't meeting regularly or monthly, I think that's just an opportunity to explore that. It may be a situation where sometimes boards don't have robust committee structures of any variety, and the executive committee can sometimes by default become the finance committee. So you may have that type of situation as well. But if you're in a school where that finance committee isn't robust and isn't meeting monthly, I think that's definitely an area to explore.
Yeah, we want to encourage that for sure. Okay, so the next thing we want to kind of discuss is, when we talk about best practices, people will, it's easy to say, well, these are the best practices. Well, what are best practices for financial operations in a school? They can vary from other businesses. So we want to take a look at what are the things that are important specifically to a school. We're going to talk today about 12 best practices, but I'm going to highlight, out of the 12, I'm going to highlight 4 and talk a little bit more in detail about those. So the first one, first best practice we want to talk about is the idea of incorporation. We do recommend that you incorporate the school as a legal entity. That doesn't mean that you're not one community. That doesn't mean that, you know, in a parish day school that we can, you know, at St. Albans, we considered ourselves to be one body, and we're a church and day school together, but we were separately incorporated. And we do recommend that. Some dioceses do not allow this. And so we do understand that if you're in Louisiana, for instance, that's not going to be allowed. But as a matter of best practice, to incorporate the school as a legal entity is important. Number two, we want to establish clear lines of authority. The vestry of a church empowers the school board to oversee the financials of the school. The school board hires a head of school, and the head of school manages the budget and oversees operations. A business manager or a business officer is the employee of the head of school. That's really important because there are times, especially in times of transition, when if there's a transition where a head of school has left, and maybe we're in the middle of hiring somebody new, or we've got a business manager that's left or whatever, sometimes the school board can step in and have to do the work until there's a new person. But it's really critical that once that takes place, that those clear lines of authority are in place. We want to see a vestry that understands its role and gives the power to the board. We want to see a school board that understands that its sole employee is the head of school. And we want to see a head of school that's managing the budget and overseeing those operations regularly. And so that's really important. Separate accounting between the church and the school. If it's a parish day school, I'm going to come back to this, but that's really important that we ensure that that the church books and the school's books are separate. And number four, that we ensure that the accounting that's taking place in the school is competent, that you have a competent accountant that does reviews and audits, and that we know that we're doing everything that follows the general accounting principles. That's really important. I want to remind you that the reason that's so important is it doesn't matter how big or small your school is. It's a business. It's a nonprofit, but it's still a business, and it needs to operate like that. Number five, to ensure financial transparency, the school board is responsible, has a fiduciary responsibility to make sure that the financials are being done properly. They have a responsibility to review the audit and look at an audit and know what's happening with the financials of the school. That's really important.
Kathy, I want to interrupt, and I want to ask a follow-up question about number two, and then also offer a shameless plug for another webinar we're offering later on this month. So I want to explore the business officer as the employee of the head of school. Occasionally that can become muddled, and that can become a situation where maybe the treasurer is overreaching and treating the business officer as his or her employee,
Right.
Or there can be a situation where the treasurer may be giving a directive to the business officer, but then the head of school is giving a directive to the business officer as well. And so I want to spend a little bit of time drilling down on what to do if we find ourselves in a situation where there's not a clear line of authority there. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, first of all, the treasurer's role is not an operational role. You're a board member, and your role is to assist with however you can. But at the end of the day, the business manager is the employee of the head of school, and the head of school gives those directives. And so it would be completely out of line for a treasurer to give a directive to a business manager that the head of school didn't know about.
Right.
Now, it may be that the head of school and the treasurer sit down and say, hey, we want it to look like this. But at the end of the day, the head of school is the one that should give that directive. I also think that this happens. Sometimes it's difficult because a lot of times there are many heads of schools that are maybe they came up through their education experience. They were teachers or they were administrators, and they're not super comfortable with accounting and finances. And it is different in a private school. We're different in that we as as a head of school, we're CEOs. And so sometimes I think what happens is a head of school will think, well, I don't know how to do that, so I'm going to defer to, and that's okay. But the goal is to learn and to know. So it is absolutely incumbent upon the head of school to, if they don't know enough about the financials side of the business, that they learn, and that they and sometimes you'll have a business manager. I had a business manager who was at St. Albans for 20 years before I got there, or 15 years before I got there. And so she knew far more about how to run a school from a financial standpoint than I did. But I learned, and she understood that at the end of the day, I was her employer, and we worked that way together. So sometimes you'll have a business manager who comes up, who's been there a long time, and they think that they kind of have a little bit more authority. And it's just really important. I think the treasurer's role is to understand their own role, and then to say to the head of school, here is your job, so that everybody understands that. Does that answer that?
Yeah, I think so. And also it really is challenging because as you mentioned, the board treasurer is a member of the board. And it's very, very challenging for a head of school to try to police or correct a board member who has overstepped his or her bounds.
Correct.
And so I want to match this up with a shameless plug. On the 23rd of August, we're doing a webinar that's focusing specifically on the role of board presidents. And that's really a situation where the board president is ideally positioned to help kind of correct that, if that makes sense. It's very, very hard for a head of school to be able to do that by himself or herself. That really steps into the role of the board president, and the board president being able to clearly remind everyone, including the treasurer, about those clear lines of authority.
Exactly.
Let's take a look at some other best practices.
Okay, so some more best practices that we want to think about in our business office. First of all, high quality bookkeeping, and we're going to talk a little bit more about what that looks like in just a minute, but ensuring that we're doing high quality bookkeeping. Following a calendar for the budgeting process. This is a question that a lot of people don't think about. When do we start the budgeting process? What does that look like? And so we're going to talk also a little bit more about that. Regular financial review, that would be in the form of an audit. That's going to be something we talk about as well. Ensuring that we have a risk management plan in place. We're going to, hopefully down the road, we're going to be able to present more information to our group about what does a risk management plan look like. But having one of those is really important. Having a shared use agreement, if you're a parish day school, between the church and the school, outlining how expenses will be shared, how space will be shared. That's really just important for the relationship between the church and the school. Having a PRISM account, PPRRSM account, that's a provision for plant replacement, renewal, and special maintenance. This account is really what you're setting aside. If it was in your home, it would be, I'm going to set aside money to replace my air conditioner. I'm going to set aside if the roof needs to be replaced. That's a PRISM account, and that's a very important practice for a school. And then ensuring that our special funds are controlled by the board. Sometimes you will find that parent associations or the sixth grade, they have their own checking accounts, and they have their own, and they kind of do their own thing. It's really critical that the board oversees all funds. That's a standard, in fact, of the association, that the board is overseeing all the funds and is controlling all the funds, even that are raised. Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit. Let's pull out the idea of a budgeting calendar. So this is just a sample of something that we did at St. Albans, but I thought it was important. This is in our board handbook, and the board is educated early on about when do we start budgeting, when do we set tuition and all that sort of thing. So let's just start with September and October. So during the fall, we began our discussions about the next year's budget. It seems early, but it's really not, because the reality is that you have to set tuition before re-enrollment, and re-enrollment is typically going to be in early spring. So for St. Albans, September and October, we would, my business manager and I would sit down and we would start to just look at our previous year's budgets. We would look at where we were in the current year. We would assess enrollment trends, establish a conservative goal for next year, and then we would begin the conversations with the finance committee about what does it look like for next year? What do we think we're going to have? And just all for the purpose of setting tuition. November, we really would kind of try to create a budget, a preliminary budget that would help us to understand what we were going to recommend as far as a tuition increase. We did that in November, because in December, we would present a recommendation to the board about what the tuition should be for the coming year. In the past, I did that in January. We did a tuition, we voted on tuition in January, but we moved it to December a few years ago. And it's really been helpful, because to do it in December gives us plenty of time in the office to prepare for putting together tuition rate sheets and all of our marketing that we were going to be doing. At St. Albans, we did re-enrollment in February, mid to late February. And so it was really important for us to be able to get that stuff out in January. And so we set tuition in December. January and February, we spent monitoring our enrollment, reporting to the board kind of where we were. The finance committee we usually would have at least one work day, where a 3 or 4 hour work session where we worked on the preliminary budget and making sure that we were, our enrollment was set reasonably and our expenses were. And then by the middle of March, we usually had a pretty good preliminary budget set. It was usually based on the number of people that we had re-enrolled, because we would finish re-enrollment in early March. And then it also included kind of what we thought we would have in the way of teachers and what we needed for teachers and for staffing. And so in March, usually late March, we would present a preliminary budget to the school board, and the school board would approve it. And that gave me the ability to then contract all my teachers, because that was in our preliminary budget. So then May through August, we spent just monitoring enrollment, making sure that we didn't need more staff, fewer staff. If things came up from that we knew we needed to change a line item, we did that. And then in August, we would take the preliminary budget, and we would make sure that if there were any amendments to it, we made those. We watched the enrollment when we started school, and then we would present a final approved budget to the board for approval. If we had, if there was a year where we in March said, oh, we think we're going to be at 230 kids, and come August we're at 270, then that's what we did. If we came to August and we were at 215, then we had adjusted all summer long. So we spent all summer long adjusting and watching enrollment and watching expenses and staffing. And that's really important. So that calendar is really going to be an important best practice for you as you as you learn how to manage your operations. So the next thing we want to talk about is the idea of separating the church and school accounting. So we have a poll question. Is the school's accounting separate from the church's accounting?
We're starting to get answers in. Give it a couple more seconds. Okay.
Okay, good. So this is great to know. This is a best practice that that does matter. One thing I do want to touch on is, there are a couple of reasons that we want to make sure that this takes place. Number one, because our standards, F1 and F2, describe the need for the school board to oversee the funds of the school. And that's the job of the board, is to do that. This cannot take place if funds are not separate. So that's really important. The other is that the best practice is that the investor gives power to the school board to steward the finances of the school. One thing I do want to touch on, and David, if you go to that next slide, I want to touch on the idea of whether the same person is managing the two separate accountings. I know that we've run into on occasion where we've got two separate sets of books, but we've got one person managing them both. And really the best practice is that the church has their business person doing their books and the school has their own business person doing their books. It can get really tricky if one person is doing both sets of books, even if they're separate. And
part of that goes back to that idea of clear lines of authority. So we definitely have seen it work when it's one person doing both, but with one person doing both, it can present the opportunity for those clear lines of authority to become more muddled.
Exactly. Can be tricky. Okay, so the next thing we want to talk about is high quality bookkeeping as a best practice. So what does that look like? We're going to give you 8 different things. There are more things, but I wanted to kind of just give you 8 ideas of the things that you should ensure that your business office is doing in order to just have high quality bookkeeping. The first is that cash is registered as soon as it arrives. We don't hold cash. We don't hold checks. We deposit regularly. That's really important. Number 2, physical assets are registered and kept up to date. You know, a school has a lot of physical assets, and this inventory idea is hard because there's so many things. There's so many books and desks and computers and all of that, but it's really important that the school understand what the physical assets are and that you keep that up to date. Number 3, that bank statements are reconciled monthly, that's a regular occurrence. The board treasurer's job is kind of a high level job to ensure with the head of school that these things are taking place. Now, if the head of school doesn't know these things, then the job of the treasurer is to say, hey, we need to make sure that all 8 things are happening. And then it's the job of the head to ensure that their business manager or their business office is doing all of these things. Number 4, 2-party checks are required. Two-party signatures, are required on all large checks. 2-party signatures are just a really important way to keep everybody safe. It can get tricky if one person is signing all the checks. And so that's just helpful. Accounting files are backed up daily. This is something that may or may not be happening. It's really important that the files of the school are being backed up every single day. Some folks will back it up onto a cloud. Some folks back it off site. Some folks will do both. And some people, my business manager was super diligent and she just never trusted the cloud. So she would back it up on the cloud and she'd back it up on site and then she would back it up on something else because that's just how she did it. But backing up does matter. Head of school approves all checks over a defined amount. It's important that the head of school, and in my school, I looked at every check. I signed every check unless I was gone. I made sure that I knew what we were spending our money on. And again, I cannot reiterate enough that the head of school's job, this is part of the job description of the head of school. It cannot be a situation where the head of school goes, well, I didn't know because the business manager does that. I can't reiterate enough that the CEO of the company should know what's happening with the finances of the company. And so please understand that that's, while it's not always something that we do know about, but we have to learn. Number 7, invoices and check stubs are kept together in a vendor file. So we're paying attention to the money that's going out and having backup for that. And then number 8, records are watched for fake vendors. That's just from a fraud standpoint, it's really important that we're looking for making sure that the things that we're doing eliminates the opportunity for fraud as much as possible.
And there's a lot of fake vendors that are just submitting invoices to schools, and they are, it's just fraud. But the invoices are dummied up to look very close. They look like it's one of your vendors, but they're really not one of your vendors. And so just always be on the lookout for that.
Right. Okay, let's talk about an audit, having an audit or an annual review. The question, does your school have an audit review, an annual review or an audit by an independent firm? This is not a poll question, but I want you to think about why this matters. So what is a regular financial review? Well, first of all, the head of school and the business manager should be reviewing financials monthly. And then those financials should also be given to the finance committee led by the board treasurer, and they should be reviewed monthly at every finance meeting. We did balance sheet and income statement, and those are the two things that we looked at every single month. And we watched for trends. We also made sure that we looked at what our income statement and our statement of cash flow was. We looked at it compared to our budget and what did that look like. So internally, you should be looking at things monthly. And then the board treasurer, again, should be presenting up-to-date financials to the school board every single month. So in our situation, we would meet, our finance committee met an hour before the board meeting. And so we would review financials and make sure that all the questions from the finance committee had been asked. And then the board treasurer would then, at the board meeting, present the financials and offer opportunity for board members to ask questions. I would also say that if there's anybody out there that is a board member, it's really important, even if you're not on the finance committee, that you look over the financials, that you read them, and that you ask questions. There will be people that serve on boards that maybe that's not their area of expertise, and so they don't ask questions. And I would submit to you that every person that is on a school board has an obligation to learn about those financials and be able to ask questions, and should be, even if you're not on the finance committee. So that's internal review. External review is the idea of an audit or a review. And every year, currently we have a current standard that is going to change in 2021. But the current standard is that once a school has had an audit, every school has to have an audit. And once they've had an audit, they can go back and forth between an audit and review, and that's current. Okay. And it also says that schools with revenue of under $500,000 can just choose a review, but that is going to change in 2021. And in 2021, the new standard is that every year the school's board of trustees will engage in an independent certified public accounting firm to perform an audit with a management letter. A school with an annual review of less than $1 million may alternate between audit and review. So you see that that's different. Every school is going to be required to have an audit at some point, beginning in 2021. And then schools with under $1 million may alternate annually between an audit and review. So let's go to why that's important. Let's talk about the importance of an audit or review. First of all, it doesn't really matter how big your school is. Bookkeeping can be complicated. You're dealing with a lot of money. You're dealing with a lot of expenses. Bookkeeping is complicated, and mistakes can be made. And having an audit or a review really helps with that. Audits offer an invaluable planning tool. Every year that we had an audit, it was so nice because our auditor would talk about, we were lucky because we had the same guy that did it every year, but he would talk about last year versus this year. He would tell us, the board, where are we doing well? Where are areas that may be a struggle that we haven't noticed? Auditors are really good about that. SAES will not accredit you without an audit. The audit is a big deal, and the standards committee feels is pretty strong about making sure that we're doing that. It's crucial protection for the head of school, the board, and the vestry. If there is anything going on, the head of the school, the board, and the vestry all are responsible for ensuring that the fiduciary responsibility of those entities, that we're doing that we're paying attention to the finances of the school. And mistakes can cost money. Rick Kellogg always says that mistakes are either embarrassing at best or lethal at worst. If you have a pretty big mistake, it can really affect the finances of your school. And most of our schools are not flush with money. They're not just, stacking gold everywhere. Most of us are on a pretty tight budget, and we're working really hard to manage our money. And a big, one mistake could really be dangerous for a school. So those are the reasons we feel are really important to have an audit, and most importantly that it's a standard of the association. So finally, we want to talk about some keys for successful relationship between the head of school and the treasurer. As we talked about earlier, the roles and responsibilities and understanding those roles and responsibilities are probably the most important aspect of having a successful relationship. It's all about communication and collaboration. Communication, first and foremost, would be monthly meetings. I would have a monthly meeting with my school board treasurer and my business manager before we even met with the finance committee, because we all wanted to be on the same page. And I had this one board member who I love dearly, but he was always going to ask a question, and it was always going to be something we hadn't thought of, and we could just count on that. And so communicating properly between the head of the school and the board treasurer, meeting monthly to look that over before the finance committee is important. Number two, insisting on transparency, making sure that we're talking about asking the questions. What is insist on transparency with the finances, making sure that the business manager is able to answer a question about an expense, or why did we spend this, or why is this over budget, or whatever. Those questions are important, and that we need to have that transparency. And then finally, being clear with the established roles. We kind of touched on this earlier, but the treasurer, again, is a board member. It's not their responsibility to run the school. It's not their responsibility to be directing anything towards an employee of the school. It's only their responsibility to work with the head of school and make sure that all of these best practices are taking place, but it's not their job to run the school. Collaboration, again, working together to create an annual budget, working together to make a recommendation for tuition, working with the finance committee for good decision making. Again, monthly meetings are critical. And finally, creating a financial dashboard and a long range financial plan. This is something that is a much bigger conversation, and probably should be the subject, and maybe the subject of a webinar down the road, because what does it look like to create a financial plan? Well, there's a lot of work to that, but doing that is important for the school. So we want to encourage you to collaborate together on that. So questions, things that we've brought up that maybe that you have not thought of, or things that you want to know about, we're here to answer.
And again, everyone, let's use that question and answer box for you to send any questions to us for the remaining time this afternoon. And I'll also do another shameless plug. Mary Catherine mentioned financial planning and the financial dashboard. That is an upcoming webinar. All these webinars are available to our members. A couple of them will have a registration fee. That one's a pretty in-depth one, and there is a $99 fee per school for that. But it's a great opportunity if that's an area that you think would be a benefit to your school. Get the entire finance committee together, or maybe even the entire board together, and participate in that webinar, because we're going to walk you through exactly what that process looks like. So great opportunity that we are hopeful will be beneficial to you. Okay, let's go to a couple questions. So here's one. Mary Catherine, when you were at St. Albans and Harlingen, talk to us about the composition of your finance committee. Who sat on the finance committee?
Great question. Our board chair sat on it. Usually the board president and the vice president. The vice president's job was really just to sit on it to learn. So we had the board president, we had the vice president, the treasurer, the head of school, the business manager, and then usually one other person on the school board that was kind of finance oriented. So ours was usually 5 to 6 people, 4 of which were board members, and then 2 of which were employees.
And I normally encourage boards to populate their committees with a couple of members who are not current board members. But I will tell you that finance committees, for the most part, tend to be all current board members or the staff members that you mentioned.
That's correct.
I'm trying to think. I'm sure we could find a situation where, if there was just someone who maybe was a previous board member who isn't on the board right now, but is of value to an asset to the finance committee, then it would be, they could sit on that committee as well. But for the most part, it tends to be more current board members than other committees.
Right. And in our situation, interesting you say that. I did one year, for about 3 years actually, I did have an additional member of the board that was a vestryman, but he was kind of the liaison to the vestry. And
Sure.
I only had him on there because he was really a savvy businessman, and he had kids at the school. And so he didn't really sit on the board, but he did sit on that finance committee and help out. The other thing in our situation is that our priest is on the finance committee as a board member too. So he usually does. He sat on that as well.
The rector of the parish. Gotcha. Here's another question. What is the best practice for the issuance of the monthly financials in term of calendar date? So I'm not exactly clear on that. Let's talk a little bit about what's the best practice for the issuance of the monthly financials in term of calendar date.
Well, if you're talking about monthly financials, we would our board met the second Tuesday of the month. So the financials that we looked at were the previous month closed out. So we might look at March, at the March board meeting, we were looking at the February financials. And they were usually closed out by the first part of March, and we were able to look at or get every expense had been paid, and so we're able to look at that. So if that's the question, it's the previous month's financials that we're looking at. So
let's walk through that. So let's say it's February, you closed the books out. Were you able to close the books out the first week of March for
usually
February?
The first week of March, yes. And then by the second week, we were able to look at the financials as of the end of February.
And then was your board meeting roughly the third week of the month?
Yeah, second or third, yeah.
So that's the other timing piece is normally that monthly finance committee is going to happen in close proximity to, but right before the board meeting.
Correct.
So that they can identify any issues that need to be brought to the board. I've seen it as close in proximity as the same week or sometimes the week before as well.
Right.
So let me know if we answered that question, then great. If you were asking something else, just send us another question because I want to make sure I understand what you were asking. Here's a great one. Tips on recruiting good treasurers. Finding this is a hard position to staff. It is a hard position to staff.
It is. And
thoughts on how to do that? Because that's a great question.
Well, of course, our first hope is that we can find an accountant. That's what we usually would go for is an accountant. And for years, and here's the other thing. We have in our bylaws the ability to, when we recruited an accountant to be on the board, and we asked them to be the treasurer, In our bylaws, you can go off the board and continue to be the treasurer and not be a voting board member, so that we had consistency and the ability to keep a treasurer for 5 or 6 years. So that's helpful. Having an accountant or a bookkeeper of some sort is really the best. But if you can't have that, we've also had a couple of bankers that were treasurers. We've had people that were, if you know how to if you're just a good businessman and you know how to,
Yeah, I was going to
there's
say,
a possibility to do that as well. A businesswoman,
business owners, small business owners, if they've got the time, is the challenge. But yeah,
right.
any small business owner or even a large business owner can be an ideal treasurer, because they're living this on a day-to-day basis.
Right. The other thing that I will say is that the idea of saying to somebody, look, if you get on as a treasurer, we're going to, and then you're willing to stay for a little bit longer period of time, then you don't have to be on the board and come to every single, being a board member is a lot of work. And so sometimes people will not want to do that if they have to be on it for a long time. But having the ability to say to our treasurer, hey, if you'll just stay on as the treasurer and do the treasurer's work, you don't have to do the other board work. That helped for consistency, and it gave us some longevity with our treasurer, which was really helpful, because if the treasurer knows what happened 3 years ago, it's easier to plan 3 years ahead, and you don't have to keep retelling your story to the new treasurer. So that was really, I think, a good thing for us, and I've seen other schools do that. And so just recruiting somebody who knows business is good. Other questions?
Let's give it a few more minutes, see if there's any other questions. Those are good questions, gang. And again, before we wrap up today, I do want to plug that board president webinar. We'll be doing this on the 23rd of August at noon. And we'll be doing a deep dive into that role of board president, because so many of the things that we've touched on today, the president plays a pretty critical role in setting the stage for that and setting the tone and the climate for that. So I'm not seeing any other questions, so we're not going to run off. We'll be around for about another 10 minutes or so. But Mary Catherine, thank you so much for taking the time today to lead our webinar.
Well, thank y'all, and I'm really just know that you're welcome to email me or have any questions about anything that we've talked about today. You've got my email. My email's on the SAES website. We'd love to be able to help you however. So thanks.
Fantastic. Thank you all so much for participating today.